Welcome, everyone. We have a wonderfully large audience via Zoom, and we have a pretty good audience here. This is an absolutely fantastic project. Thank you to Annette for suggesting Dr. Lopez as a speaker. I don't see Annette. Oh, Annette's getting a sandwich. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez, for suggesting Dr. Lopez as a speaker. This is a really intriguing project, and I'll just begin by we are, of course, in the crisis of the humanities. It's year 387 of the crisis of the humanities. It's been going on forever, or eternally in crisis. And one thing people debate is whether we need to be more serious about our rigorous scholarship or whether we need to engage the public more. And what Dr. Lopez's work suggests is, why is this a dichotomy? Why not both? Who in the world thought that the exacting recovery of seemingly lost orthographies sits in contradiction to comic books? And we already in debating this, but Martha, is this a comic, or is it I don't know, a graphic dissertation? Are you sort of creating a new genre here because you're getting into this incredibly thoughtful empirical work? I don't suggest that you submit this as your doctoral dissertation. I don't want that on me, but you are in some ways doing something path-breaking, and you have degrees from really smart places as befits the project: UC Berkeley, PhD from UC Santa Barbara, and a postdoc at UC Santa Barbara. And Dr. Lopez is an incredibly smart, innovative scholar. As you'll see in a minute, I leave it to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. And before I begin, I did want to thank the whole of UT Austin, the Institute for Historical Studies, Courtney, who actually made sure I got here today because there were a couple little snags, and of course to Annette for inviting me here to speak. It really is an honor to be here, especially since UT Austin is one of the most influential hubs for the study of Mesoamerica, especially in this country. And so it's actually a little more stressful than it usually is to come to one of these events, because I'm like, oh, people will actually know what I'm talking about. So I'm on my best behavior. I do want to acknowledge that I join you all today here on this unceded land with a great many Native people: the Alabama Coshata, the Caddo, Coyolxauhqui, Comanche, Carrizo, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, Isleta del Sur Pueblo, Yaqui, Tigua Pueblo, Kiowa, Wichita, Chickasaw, Wahco, and I would hear a lot more for maybe not necessarily from this area originally, but a lot of Native people here, and that's really wonderful. So while my primary goal is looking at Central Mexico, looking specifically at Nahua areas and Nahua texts, ultimately my much larger goal is one of solidarity, one of bringing in diverse Indigenous people from across the Americas, the hemispheric Americas, because really colonization is continuing, and these are types of knowledge, types of ontologies that were largely eradicated. And so as much as we can share this knowledge across a wide variety of Indigenous people, the better. And I think that I'm not trying to romanticize some sort of pre-Hispanic past, but what I do believe is that these ideas, the ideas of Indigenous people past and present, can really go a long way in informing our decisions into a rather uncertain future, I would say. Okay, so and this is just to give us an idea. Yeah, this is where I'm mostly looking, but we're actually on that map right now. And so we are in an area where there are people who are in the language family of Nahuatl. It extends all up through the US Southwest. Okay, this is me in a comic. Okay, today I want to share with you some of my research, specifically on Indigenous women. I'm really interested in recovering a lot of the Indigenous women from these texts. These women, due to the violence of colonization, have often been lost, ignored, or vilified for the last 500 years. My main interest is in the visual glyphic texts. That said, I do rely very heavily on the alphabetic texts in order to decipher what I'm reading. Perhaps in looking at women, perhaps the most widely known Indigenous woman of this area is Malinche. Now, my presentation isn't on Malinche or Doña Marina or other names she's known by. Hers is a very difficult story, but I do think it's emblematic of what we see happening to Indigenous women when Spanish people or colonizers or even Western academics are the ones who take the lead in talking about women of Indigenous Americas. Now, prior to Spanish invasion, women held a great variety of prestigious positions. Okay? My particular focus, the area I'm most interested in, is women as religious leaders, as older sisters. But in looking through these texts, I found a wide variety of different occupations where we see women who are not regularly talked about. So, for example, we may all know that women were almost exclusively the ones who were in charge of making textiles, and various scholars, such as Louise Perkart, have argued that because of this, women were largely responsible for the entire economic structure of Mesoamerica before the arrival of the Spanish. We also know that women were educated in many of the same ways that men were. And so this here is a Tlacuilo, a writer-painter. We can see she's in the act of painting here. I also want to point out some really fun things glyphically here on the side closest to me in the box. We have a floral shape painted in black and white. On the other side, we have two speech scrolls that are back to back. And they're both in black and white. And if you know about the Francismos, which I'll mention again later, but these coupling of ideas or objects, then we know that this is a common convention in Nahuatl. And so that black and white is a glyph for writing. Oh. Now, the one on this side is a flower. The one on the far side is a kind of eloquent speech or song. And so that would make this the flower and the song. And that is another difracismo for poetry. And so here we have a writer, painter of poetry. But there are plenty of examples of women like this. This is an example from the Florentine Codex, book 12. And we see a woman in the profession of a deceit or a medical practitioner. Deceit has a lot of translations. Usually women are not listed. They're not mentioned as holding these occupations unless it is translated specifically as midwife. It's one of the many translations of this. But we can see from the images, even though the translations tell us that these are men, from the images we see women occupying a lot of these roles. Okay, and I will say that there's one image, I've spared you of it, but if you're familiar, the Getty Museum just put up a searchable Florentine Codex, the complete thing, and you can search English, Spanish, Nahuatl, and images, everything. If you look up urinary obstruction, it is quite a fascinating image of a female medical practitioner and a male patient with a urinary obstruction. Anyway, I wanted to spare you the image for this presentation, but if you're curious, I recommend looking it up. And of course, women were engaged in things like commerce. I wanted to show this example specifically from the Florentine Codex for a number of reasons. One is that this is one of the few areas that scholars have mentioned that there were errors in the translation. So the Spanish translation, as well as the standard English translation that many people use by Anderson and Dibble, refer to this is the maguey cape seller as him, he who sells maguey capes. This was mentioned by James Lockhart, who is a very famous Nahuatl scholar, or was, no longer with us. But it was as a footnote. And so these things largely go really unspoken of. And so while it is acknowledged by many scholars, it's not something that is focused on very much in these more academic texts. I also point out, lest there be any confusion about who may be selling, maybe she's just looking at these capes and he's the one selling it. One of the common conventions in these texts is to represent the person in a more powerful position as larger. And so you can see that she is the one who has much more influence. This is not just a large woman and a very small man. This is to really show who has a position of influence in this relationship. This is a convention that's seen in a lot of different Mesoamerican traditions as well. So it's also seen in Mayan texts. Okay, see, I ad-lib so much, I'm like way past this page. All right. Now, in looking at women, I go down a lot of these rabbit holes, and I was really interested in these racismos, in how the language around womanhood behaves. And I found, and these are well known, these two difracismos, one representing women and one representing men. And this goes a long way to kind of explain how representations work as well. And so various scholars like Silvia Marcos does quite a bit of work on gender, and various people like Cecilia Klein and Rosemary Joyce have written quite a bit about how clothing really makes the gender. So girling the girl, boying the boy kind of thing. And so we see that for a woman, this quait, which is the skirt, and the huipili, or the huipil, or the blouse, is the woman, it makes the woman, and the mashlat and the tilmachli, or the loincloth and the cape, make the man. I did want to point out, though, that in a lot of these glyphic representations, you don't need both. A lot of the women are not wearing a huipil. Instead, they're wearing a quechquemat, which is like a triangular shaped blouse, or like like a poncho kind of thing, right? Just goes over the head. And so a huipil is not necessary in the representation of a woman. Similarly, a cape is not necessary in the representation of a man. And in fact, in a lot of these texts, men are most commonly seen without a cape. It's just with a loincloth. Okay. Less common with women. But I wanted to point this out because there's some really interesting things going on with skirts and representations of these of gendered individuals. And so here's an image. This is one from the Codex Xochiquetzal, also known as the Codex Borda. And here we have on your right, Ehecat, and on your left, we have Mictlan Tecutli. These are largely regarded as masculine figures, but both of them happen to be wearing skirts. And so it's much easier to recognize on your left than it is on your right, but we can see that, like trying to point over there, we can see that not only are they wearing skirts, but they're also wearing loincloths. They're wearing both at the same time. Now, various scholars have talked about clothing. So Patricia Anawalt basically wrote the book on pre-contact clothing, and she does actually talk about this art of clothing, and she calls it a kilt, which I think is quite interesting, but does not produce a Nahuatl word for kilt. There is no, at least that anyone I know has found, a word specifically for a skirt worn by a man. And I think this also presents a little bit of an issue because we don't see this just with men. We don't see only men wearing skirts. We also see women wearing loincloths, which I'll get to in a minute. But I want to point out here that there's interesting language about womanhood here to be found. And so there's this word, coitia, or also spelled coitia, which means literally to put on a skirt. You skirt yourself, is what it means, right? But it's also the same exact word is used to say that you hold a leadership position, you hold this position of influence over a certain thing. And generally speaking, whatever that skirt is made of, whatever the quality is of that skirt, that is what you have a charge over. Okay. So some interesting things going on there. And so these are some images that I wanted to point out because of this problematizing of the skirt and men in kilts, and because here we have a really, I'd say, one of the more recognizable indigenous goddesses, I'll use for deities, for lack of a better word in English. And this is Tlazolteotl, also known as the filth eater. We can recognize her from the dark part around her mouth, known to be eating sin, which is, again, horrible translations. And it's quite obvious that she's a woman. We actually see her breast is exposed. And she is wearing that skirt. We can see the bottom of it in red around her thighs. But if we look here, we can see that she has that loincloth as well. And we can see this knot behind her, which is quite commonly represented in loincloths. And so this is not an unusual image. And if you look at the Codex Xochiquetzal, also known as the Codex Vaticanus B, we're trying to rename all of our codices, then you would see quite a few women wearing skirts and loincloths simultaneously. And so the question is, I mean, really, what does this mean? And I would argue it is that these things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And so even in talking about women in leadership positions, it's important to talk about how this strict kind of binary is artificially imposed. And so we need to really think about what does that even mean to talk about women in these kinds of positions. On that far side from the Codex Telleriano-Romensis, which is, as far as I know, nobody's tried to rename, a shame, because that's a mouthful. We have a figure who represents the moon. Now, the moon is known by a variety of names. So we have a couple here on the side. The one behind their head is Xochiquetzal. Xochiquetzal is well known from the Codex Chimalpopoca, where we have one of the versions of this kind of origin narrative where Xochiquetzal is the one who was supposed to become the sun, but was kind of a chicken and didn't want to jump in, and then jumped in second, and then ended up just becoming the moon. Now, it's unclear to me personally whether or not this individual is male or female, and I think this makes a lot of sense because Xochiquetzal, as far as I know in that narrative, at least the way people talk about it, I need to go back and translate it myself, I suppose, is talked about as a male figure. But if we know about the moon, and if we know about the associations of the moon, it doesn't quite make a whole lot of sense that you would have a male moon figure. And certainly that comes into place when we think about figures like Coyolxauhqui, again, one of the most widely known figures in the ancient Mesoamerican, specifically Aztec narratives, right? So we have this Coyolxauhqui stone, and here she is said to represent the moon. I want to point out here, she's not wearing a skirt. She has been murdered. This is a very interesting story, I think. I want to point out that she's the older sister of Huitzilopochtli. And I don't know if people are familiar with this narrative, so I'll recount it very quickly. Huitzilopochtli is the principal deity, again, for lack of a better translation, the principal deity of the Aztecs. The story goes that Coyolxauhqui is the oldest sister. There are 400 other brothers and sisters. And they know that when, their mother gets pregnant, that it is for some reason wrong. It's complicated, but for some reason it's wrong, and they plot against her, and they try to kill her. Now, Huitzilopochtli figures this out somehow. I don't know. He's got spies outside of the womb. And when he's born, he kills her. He's born fully armed, and he kills his older sister. So here she is after she's been slain by her younger brother, presumably younger brother. And so we can see that she's been dismembered. It's quite an unpleasant thing in some ways. I want to point out here that she's actually wearing a loincloth. Now, it is a snake. It is a snake loincloth, but we see this emblematic knot that accompanies that loincloth, and it is in the same general area and region. It is designed to mirror a loincloth in some ways. So in talking about older sisters, I want to point out that this word Iwelti, it means his older sister. We see that quite a bit in a lot of these texts, his older sister. We also see another version, Ipijuan, which means her older sisters. And these terms, they're of course gendered depending on who you're talking about and the relationships, but roughly they mean the same thing, and they're used in both cases. They're used to talk about not just literal older sisters, but in a nature not unfamiliar to us, I think, as Westerners with the Catholic Church and whatnot, that a sister doesn't really mean in the church sense that you're talking about a relative. Right? You're talking about like, oh, the sister blessed me at church. Okay, well, you're not talking about your sibling. You're talking about someone who has a leadership position here. And so throughout Book 6 of the Florentine Codex, it talks quite a bit about how these women, I think the word they use is bithia. They become older sisters. And this is not to say that they have younger siblings who are being born after them. It means that they're being trained in the church. Okay, and I think this is really significant because what we end up seeing there is that these women who have leadership positions in the text often get dismissed because they're seen instead as siblings, maybe angry siblings like this one. Oh, I don't want my mom to be pregnant. I'm going to go crazy and I'm just going to kill her. And then we see it as kind of a infanticide, matricide kind of thing, rather than what was likely happening, which was that we see someone who is in a leadership position who is challenging someone in another leadership position. And I want to mention also that there's another quite famous older sister, which is Siwakoat. Literally, her name means a woman snake. Now, generally speaking, when we talk about Siwakoat, though, this is a rank. This is a political rank that people held. And so Tlatoani is the leader, the speaker, the head of the Aztec Empire. And the second in command is the Siwakoat. And that is an older sister. And so I think rethinking the way we think about sisters, older sisters, women, and their place in society, in Aztec society, is especially important because, especially since I think due to the historical record and the way it's been treated, people tend to see the Aztecs as the patriarchal indigenous people. Right? The Mayans, they were better, right? Other indigenous groups, they were matriarchal, but the Aztecs are seen as very macho, very warrior driven, and not matriarchal, as we see in a lot of other indigenous cultures. Okay, so she's a very famous one. The other older sister that really, to be honest with you, got me into this research was a narrative. This is a narrative from the Codex Chimalpopoca. It talks about Quetzalcoatl. It's kind of a famous story. This is the one that people cite when they talk about Cortez, right? That he's tricked. They say he has sex with his older sister. And then in shame, he travels to the coast, sets himself on fire, sails off in a blaze of defeat, I suppose. But apparently he will return. And so this is where we get this idea that Cortez returned. But going through this narrative, there's really no indication, one, that they had intercourse. I'm not sure where that came from. It's not in the text. And the other thing is that they use this word, ihuelti, which is that word that I already mentioned, is the word used to describe these women in a position of power within the belief system, within the Aztec church, right? And so if we look at it that way, then this isn't a story about Quetzalcoatl, who was a religious leader, having this night of incestuousness and being ashamed. It actually turns into a very different story where they're equals, that they are in some ways counterparts, male female counterparts within this tradition. And in rereading that narrative, they did get drunk, which they may or may not have been allowed to do. But what they didn't do was they didn't do the ceremonies that they were supposed to do. That was their job, right? The things that they were supposed to do. No mention of sex, no mention of intercourse. And so no incest, right? And so in being able to reanalyze this kind of narrative, we take this woman, Quetzalpetlatl, from being the victim of an incestuous night to being a leader who is on par with Quetzalcoatl, the most widely known of indigenous deities from Mesoamerica, which is a huge, in my mind, a huge shift and a really important one. And for the record, I don't actually think that this is Quetzalpetlatl, but I haven't been able to find an image of her anywhere, but I thought it would be more fun if you could actually look at someone instead of just see a couple words on the screen. Okay. And as per usual, I completely don't know what page I'm on anymore. Okay, so we'll just give up on that for the moment. Another older sister is Magay. Now, I put this text really small on the bottom because I can never remember what the title of this book is. So, in the treaties of the heathen superstitions that today live among the Indian natives to this new Spain, in that book, they do talk quite a bit about older sisters, and one of the older sisters that they mention is Magay, also known as Eight Dekbat, or Eight Flint and Blade. And so this, one of my comic books here, and I do have some copies for people who are interested. This comic book really tries to explore her role and uncover the kind of the sadness of her story, but also the power and the beauty of her story. I won't recount it here, but we, if people have questions or if you want to take a look, I encourage you to look at that. She becomes a really important person in belief systems, and also to quite a number of different tribal groups who rely on her for subsistence. Most people wore clothes made of maguey, not of cotton, right? So she becomes a really vital source of life for a lot of Mesoamerican people. So how cool is it that I get to have a comic book version of myself? Is there no, I mean, if there's no other good reason to make comic books, it's that you can put yourself in them and make yourself look cool, which if you work with an artist, you'll discover that that's the hardest part, is getting them to make you look the way you look. And so here, on this page specifically, I'm trying to incorporate imagery from the codices in new ways, make it more appealing to people. And also I'm incorporating language as well, Nahuatl language. And so I'm trying to really combine all these things. And then, here's another image. I used part of this before, but I think one of the really valuable things about this kind of medium is that it can do what the original text did and does.
Oh.
Right? Now, this particular comic, this is the first one I made. It's called How to Read an Aztec Comic. I'll say the comic, just so you know now, is a pun. Comic is a Nahua word, right? And so it's basically how you can read this object as a glyph, or how you can read a comic book, right? So we have both at the same time. Now, this was originally based on a 30-page article, which is a great article, read, it's great, wonderful. But in this comic, which is really 5 pages, I was able to put more information, more nuance to discuss, without discussing, but presenting it in visuals, more decipherment. And I'll also say that my students really love it. It pulls them through. They can make their own discoveries. They can see connections across the pages of different things taking place. And it is accessible, right? And this question of should academia, should we maintain our tall walls and keep other people out, or should we reach out and say, hey, this is important knowledge here? And for my work, because it's decolonial, I do not think that it belongs in the ivory tower. It really needs to be shared with the people who are the ones who have this as their heritage, their cultural heritage. And so this makes it accessible to them, whether or not they're in college. And again, not just people from this part of Mexico or Latin America. I've talked to people who do workshops in Hawaii, and they use this to talk about how they can create something like this to preserve their own culture. And so these kinds of storytelling, I think, are really remarkable tools to bring forward to a next generation of young people and of scholars. If people are interested, especially our online audience, since you can't pick up a copy that's sitting right here on the counter, this is a QR code that'll take you to the how to read an Aztec comic text, which was our last slide. If you do go to that link, it does have a link. It should have a link, unless you're on a very small screen, on the right side, that will link you over to my other comic book. So if you just look at the list of other things available, the one with my name is the other comic book there. And so I would just leave with this, that when people, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions, but I think that a lot of people have worked very hard to maintain and to recover a lot of knowledge in these various texts. But whether intentional or unintentional, women continue to be missing. And I think that many of these omissions could have just been avoided if people bothered looking at the images. Just look at the images. And so while it may seem silly, I think that comic books are really just an extraordinary way of being able to say, hey, look, this is what was in the text. And they can see for themselves that there are women there without having to translate gender pronouns in one way or another. And thank you again for inviting me. If people have any questions, I will take them, but thank you so much.
Let's start with Zoom today, sure.
Bianca Quintanilla.
Bianca.
Bianca, yeah. She said, I would love source suggestions to read more about the interpretation of, I'm going to butcher it, I'm so sorry. The stone?
The Coyolxauhqui stone?
Yes. She said, I've seen this image before, but I had no idea what to make of it.
Oh, sources for the Coyolxauhqui stone. I mean, there's I will say, thank you so much for the question. I have some students right now who are working with me in research, and they're absolutely new to, as many people are, which is understandable. There's not a lot out there about how to really read these kinds of glyphs and glyphic records. And they asked me, well, what should I read to prepare me? And I'm like, about that. I mean, a lot, I guess, to just read everything with a critical eye. I'm going to say something that may make me sound like a reverse sexist, but what I would say is, go to Google Scholar, search for Coyolxauhqui, and then try to just read the female scholars first. And again, I think that this is just a fairly usual convention that people who are of a certain gender are more likely to focus on that gender. It's not as a rule, but it is extraordinarily common. But unfortunately, there's a lot of things out there that I don't agree with. Doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means I disagree. So I wish I could provide a better answer to that question. If I think of something, I'll say it.
Oh, sure, yeah.
A little thing I thought about your both the comics you put on for us online. Then I thought it was excellent that we have this text and you managed to put on a little line the sources. I thought that, historians, that's great, the references inside this unusual, presentation. Then that's, I wanted to congratulate because I think that's an excellent idea. Another thing regarding what you have just said is then that, as you say, sometimes we understand, Western people, wholly what was there, in this, transmitted, Codices by, of course, the Spanish, etc. people, because probably we have already our ideas instead of, like you put there, we should have seen, the baby, instead of imagining wrong things, just not to have preconcepts and just come there with fresher view. That's if you want to, that's a little bit what you were perhaps saying, but yeah.
Yeah, so I will say that thank you for your comments and feedback. I will say even within the comics, I myself and my artist who really took pains to cite references because my artist, while he is a tremendous artist himself, did not kind of create most of these images, right? He is recreating them. And so we do put citations directly in the comic book, and they're small and they're hidden, but if people look, they're there. And so I do think it's important that way people can go back and look at these things. And thankfully today in our modern age, there's a wonderful thing about technology that is that so many of these texts are readily available to people again. They've been held up mostly in Europe, mostly in places that are inaccessible. Right? You cannot see the Codex Xochiquetzal at all. It's locked up in the Vatican, right? But we have a really high resolution copy of it online, and so people could find that online and go and look at it. And so I do think it's really important to provide those citations. I'll also say, translation is a hard thing, right? Whether you're translating culturally or linguistically, it can be extremely challenging. Now, when the Spaniards came, they largely did not bring Spanish women with them, right? And so you have a large collection of Spanish men who are writing about the whole of indigenous culture, and they're religious men. They're not even supposed to be talking to the women, right? And so you end up with very skewed knowledge. Also, the Spanish language, beautiful language, highly gendered. Meanwhile, Nahuatl is not gendered at all, right? There's no such thing as a gendered pronoun. And so when you're talking about things like the one who sells maguey capes, in Spanish, they would say el hombre que, right? But it's not a man. But, in English, you can say the one who, but in Spanish, you don't see that non-gendered language. And so through this act of translation, and then people historically for the last 500 years have been far more likely to speak and read the Spanish than to try to attempt to learn the Nahuatl. And so you have scholars reproducing this translation for generation after generation. And so again, I think I'm not trying to cast aspersions. I think that many people are well-meaning. They're really trying to find knowledge, to maintain knowledge, to extract, to share. But unless we go back to that original, right? Which most of us don't, unless you're like me and you happen to have a good job that lets you do it. It's extremely difficult to access these kinds of things, to take the time to learn the language, to take the time to read all of the books that have been written about how you could possibly decipher it. It just is mind-boggling. Even to me, I'm like, I'm tired. It's a lot of work. So this, this is a common issue.
And you work only in English, or do you have the version like Santiago was telling us, it was in Spanish and in English? Do you have an option, like you were saying, for the people whose heritage this is?
I'm actually in the process, again, I've got too many projects going at once. So if people want to recommend someone to me, I'm in the process. There's not a lot of text in these comics, but I was hoping to find someone who's really good at translation to because I'm not. I'm good at translating it from my own knowledge. But things like this, I want to make sure that it's done right. But I have already spoken with my academic publisher about republishing them in Spanish, and so that is on my to-do list. Unfortunately, it's not done yet, but it's on there.
I have a question that goes with Dr. Martinez.
Yeah, I actually, I was gonna ask that question, so it's
Yeah.
the exact right question.
So mine is, how did you come up with the idea of making a comic book? And then Dr. Monica Martinez said she'd love to hear more about the collaboration with the artists to develop. Did you create a storyboard to share, or like what was your process?
Yeah. I wish I could take more credit, but I can't. My artist, his name is Jordan Culver, and he's amazing. I mean, he's really just an amazing artist. This is what he does, is he takes academic work and he turns it into comic books. He's in very high demand. Luckily, we get along well. Usually it's people in the sciences who make comic books. And to be honest, when I was shopping around for a comic book artist, I had other people in mind. It's like, oh, I know Latino artists who already draw this stuff. And then I saw a sample of his work, and he was so good at taking really complex science and making it accessible. And I actually have a science background. I'm like, this is really great. And so he's just really amazing. And so usually what we do is we talk quite a bit. I tell him the big picture message that I want to get across. I tell him some of the details, and then we basically just go back and forth. It's very collaborative, right? It's like, I think maybe we should include this, this, and this. Send me images. And then I just, poor guy, I just bombard him with images after image, or image after image. And then we work together on putting it together. He mostly does the visual planning and mapping it out. I will say each time we were supposed to make a 4-page comic, and both times it ended up longer. And so, but that's a real benefit, I'd say, because so he would make a cover page, and then we got it printed the codex style, in accordion style, and so you actually read it like you would read a codex. And so it was just kind of a happy accident, and then the cover is kind of a guide in how to read it. But yeah, I again wish I could take more credit. Find good people to work with. That's my recommendation on that. Yeah.
I just wanted to piggyback on that question and sort of the process by which doing the whatever you call it. I get that comic is the pun. So, but the graphic version of your scholarship, how is that informed? How are you going to do it for an academic audience going forward?
So this is complex. This is a complicated.
Those are the questions.
Yes, I know. And I will say, without I love my home school and my department. I think that they're wonderful people. But I will say that I've already been up for my halfway to tenure review, and it was challenging because it was not recognizable, my work, in a lot of ways. It did not translate, right? Translation again, right? It did not translate to academics. And so I realized that I need to spend a lot more energy kind of explaining and justifying how this is an academic text. But really, without sounding too blasé, I kind of just don't really care. I mean, the goal of my work is to make this accessible. And so I am actually writing a very kind of straightforward version of it that I am going to put out there in the world. I've already set things up. But my next project, which I plan on starting probably within the next year, is a full-length graphic novel.
Oh, wow.
And so while it's not common to have an academic graphic novel, it has been done. There are some. And so we'll see how the powers that be take to that. But I mean, these are the hard things to navigate, right? This is new territory,
Right.
For the vast majority. We have scholars who are creative scholars, but I'm really trying to do both. right? I'm doing the hard research, and it's not beautiful things and fictional works or poetry. And this is academic text, but written in a very creative format. So we'll see. We'll see. Hopefully, my university is young enough, is kind of progressive enough that they seem amenable. They want to make this change with me. So we'll see. We'll see how it turns out. But yeah, this is new territory.
I guess what I was getting at is there any way in which going at the like standard university peer review process through an academic press, you're coming at that and saying within that container, having done something that's so accessible, like, oh, I thought this was my point. Now it turns out that this is my point. If that makes it okay, so the old gendered cliche, right, is you're ready to publish your book when you can explain it to your mom. I'm just repeating it, okay? I'm not, because your mom might have a PhD, but there's a way in which, like, doing this has led you to like rethink what you can do within the old container, or is it just the old container? I'm not going in there again.
I'm not going to say the old container needs to just be thrown away. But I will say that there are inherent flaws in that container, right? This might get too heavy. My apologies.
Go
But
ahead.
one of my
Stop taping now.
one of my instructors, advisors, when I was a graduate student, early on in my career, I told him that this was my goal, that I wanted to write things that were accessible. And he said it was not possible. Now, he later died. And I think he died in part because of his frustration and sadness over not feeling like he was able to write for his own community.
Oh.
And so during our discussion, we cried together. This idea that we could not, in this sphere, be able to and succeed and actually maintain a career to write for the people who really are inspiring us. I don't want that future for myself. And so I think it's really important that I hold on to that. Whether or not that means that I may have to change schools, I don't think so. Again, I think I have enough people on my side at my school to really make that happen. But the old way of doing things is largely inaccessible. And if it's not written in an academic enough voice, people tend to not respect it. Mm-hmm. I think that's unfortunate, because I do think that the mark of a really, really great scholar, someone who's figured out, they can explain it to their mom.
Yeah.
Right. But we can't write those texts.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question, the funding you've been able to secure for the collaboration. I mean, I assume your artist is not working for free. I'm curious, some people in the humanities who want to explore something like this, what are different foundations receive this provided support?
I've been very fortunate. On my campus, we have a Center for Humanities that funds these kinds of projects, and so they funded both of these. It's hard. It's hard to find them. I will say, I think that my artist really undercharges.
Good to know.
The amount of so, I mean, really, I feel like these texts should be thousands of dollars to create, and they're really not that expensive.
Wow.
In part because I think that a lot of these artists are so proficient at what they do that they can turn it over rather rapidly. So I'll say that it takes less money than you would guess. But yeah, I mean, most of the, in fact, all of the funding I've received so far has been internal to my university or to the UC system in California. I've heard that there might be other places to find funding. I haven't found them yet.
Mm-hmm.
But when I do, I'll be sure to apply, and then I will let you know, and we can be in competition with one another.
There's a question on Zoom. Thank you so much for your
Toggle back and forth.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Lopez. I'm currently in Professor Rodriguez's public history course, and last week we talked about your work, especially the accessible format that it takes. A classmate was wondering about your intended audience for the comics, and I'd love to hear you speak a bit more about this. Have you been able to keep track of who is teaching with these materials, and is there anyone who you would like to be using them? From Amy?
Anya.
Anya.
Yeah.
Oh, I'd love for everyone to be using them. I mean, that would be great. You know, basically just the people who have reached out are the people who I know use them. I've heard from people, professors from various places, UC San Paulo, other UCs. I know a professor at Yale who uses it, which I'm like, oh, fancy, all right. Even Yale students would rather be reading comic books. And then community groups. I'm really most interested in community groups. I think it's great to use it on a college campus. But I will say I've done work in my local community. So I'm at UC Merced. Merced is in the center of California, known as the Central Valley. I don't know if people are familiar with California. It's farmland.
Mm.
I mean, it's not anywhere near a big city. And so we have a lot of Latinos. And we have a lot of Latinos who are not going to college. And I've done events in the community, and I've had young Latinos come up to me and they say, oh, this is wonderful. And then they say, can I take some more? Can I take some more? And so for me, that brings me so much joy. I'm like, yes, take more. And they say, I have a group that we meet. And I'm like, okay, that's excellent. And so really, ultimately, that's my goal, is seeing community work on it. It's great in schools as well. But again, if everyone could read them, that would be perfect. Anyone who has the slightest interest in comic books, in ancient Mesoamerica, in indigenous traditions, in women, whatever. Yeah, that's my goal.
So, fantastic talk
Thank you.
and fantastic project. Really excited about this work. So I want to kind of take us back to the question of translation and knowledge. Although I could talk to you for hours, and I know I'm going to get some time offline to talk to you about all of the other aspects of this public history work. But I was really, so not that long ago, well, okay, so let me track that. My mother wrote a book called Xochiquetzal. And in that book in the 1970s, largely understood as the first history of Mexican and American women in the United States, printed on her own, small press, small batch publication, part of that feminist publication explosion in the 1970s, right? Partially enabled by federal grants. And in that book called Dios y Hembra tracks back to the goddesses, and in some ways is kind of traversing the same with what she had to work with, of course, at that time, where you couldn't actually see the codices except perhaps in books, but does recover that history of women as leaders and merchants and community members. And she herself was she identified as a feminist and an information specialist. And she revealed to me not that long ago, I've been working on a book on Chicano feminism in the 70s, and I've been interviewing her. And she said, well, you know, I really understand myself as a modern day Latina. And so that was really striking. And she gave me Miguel León Portilla's book, which is, I'm sure you're familiar with, a classic, right? And classic in the Chicano movement too, actually used a book published in Mexico that was a translation into Spanish of, you probably know much more about this than I do, but a series of interviews done with men by a Jesuit, of course, who was transcribing the thought philosophy of the Nahua, right? And the book is called, you know, The Thought and Philosophy of the Nahua. And of course, the Chicano movement took this Mexican book and kind of ran with it in developing their own cosmology, nationalist cosmology. But what was interesting about that book was a couple of things. One was that it was very shocking to me to see the epistemology and ontology of indigenous peoples having been recorded in the moment when they were still sort of held on to these traditions and beliefs and knowledges, and then translated into Spanish. But the other thing, like, it was just kind of shocking. It was like this portal, kind of like your comic books, into an indigenous life world that is quite unusual if you think about it in the annals of American genocide, right? That you have this access point, like en la fuente, las raíces, you know. But the other thing was, it was a translation in Spanish, and we didn't have the original, and everything was gendered male. My mother had sent me her own transcription on the Tlamatini, and it was gendered neutral. And when I compared it, when thinking about it, and I read both of them, so she had translated Leon Portillas into English. And Leon Portilla was gendered male. His Tlamatini, he assumed that the Tlamatini, these are the knowledge keepers in Aztec society, that they were male. Again, he was operating at a distance of many hundreds of years from when this was transcribed, right? And so he assumed that they were gendered male, but my mother had translated that into English and had gendered it not female or male, but they, referring to they. And so pulling out like it's so incredibly striking, the difference between the Spanish that's gendered male and the kind of work it does, right? And the ways in which the neutrality, right, of the gender in English does a whole different kind of work. In just the translation, she wasn't even making an argument about how these are actually men and women, but it was the translation neutrality of gender was really incredible to kind of compare. And so I was really inspired by this, and I wrote a whole chapter on her Tlamatini knowledge praxis, like, because once she told me this, I understood 100% what she was saying and what her information praxis was, which I think shares many similarities with what you're doing, which is knowledge by the people, for the people, of the people, right? And so just as to finish this up, my class last semester, we published a magazine called Tlamatini, the Knowledge Keeper. And we're doing it this semester too. And that magazine is intended not just for the student community and our community here, but also for their parents, their grandmothers, you know, their community. So they take home these magazines, the physical magazines, not online. And so I just wanted to, like, as you were speaking, I wanted to just confirm and reaffirm the sensibility that, you know, how one translates these ideas is really dependent on the scholar who's translating them, and also really can be very transformative in terms of what it enables people many generations after these knowledge practices have been recorded to imagine themselves as. So it's so incredibly important, your work. It's more of a statement, it's not a question. Love to hear what you have to say about the Leon Portilla maybe, and he's, I think, in that camp of perhaps misgendering or maybe following a misgendering.
You know, whenever I get questions about Miguel Leon Portilla, it's always, it's challenging, because I have to give him all the credit. I mean, he really was working with indigenous people and nobody else was doing it, right? He did something extremely important, monumental. I probably would not be here, right, if not for him. That said, certainly he had blind spots, and certainly he was not thinking about things like gender as he was writing. He was writing in Spanish the way he understood it. And I would say a lot of people who are Spanish speakers, when they say el hombre que, they're not necessarily thinking about a man. They are thinking about it, right? They're thinking about it without gender. And so it's really just us from the outside. We're like, no, right? It's like coming into a room and saying, hey guys, it takes that critical distance to realize that you're gendering people. So it's challenging. He's great, but he's not perfect, right? Heroes are always dangerous. You don't want to hold anyone up too high. I think, you know, hearing about your mother, who sounds like an absolute inspiration. I think
If she were here, she would be she would be raising her hand the whole time. Would dominate the conversation, so it's good that she's not.
Yeah, I think these are really important questions to think about, and I think that was very insightful of her. Most of those records, they are from men.
Right.
Only the men, well, women were, I have an image of it in this comic. While the women were trained to write beforehand, when the Spaniards arrived, that was done with. That was not allowed at all. The old traditions of writing had to be kept underground. So if women did write for some time after that, it was not made known to anyone. And then the men who were trained to write in alphabetic texts, or the men who were recording these texts, they all men, right? These were all men. That said, you know, the Florentine Codex, those 12 volumes, I mean, this immense project. At the time that it was written, we had, say we, as if I was there. We had the Coyolxauhqui, we had all these plagues. People were dying. I mean, it was like COVID times 100, right? People were just dropping like flies. It arguably killed somewhere around 80% of the population. And so these scribes, who, yes, were mostly men, or entirely men as far as we know, they were frantic. They saw this as an opportunity to record things that might just be entirely lost. And so I think that they were really dedicated, and they say it in the text that this is not their knowledge that they're writing down, that they are going into the community and they're talking to elders. And so that doesn't mean that they're just talking to men, right? Men and women were keepers of knowledge, right? These Tamatini. And so I think it was very insightful of her. Even though we have male writers, it doesn't mean that they're writing about exclusively men, right? There's a lot of nuance in the language that allows us to see that this is much more inclusive. Yeah.
And also, just to add to that, just the power of historical knowledge in the context of colonization and genocide is just, it cannot be underscored enough. Because especially in this moment on our campus, my students feel embattled, they feel marginalized, and they feel very strongly that they don't belong here, that nobody wants them here. Yeah. And so to embrace a concept as ancient, and even in a small way, because we're not studying all the Aztec codices, right? We're taking this one concept of the Tlamatini, and to embrace that concept in Nahua society and to be able to occupy that position is not just like taking power or whatever, it's also kind of recovering some part of themselves that most of the students in the class are Latino. And that feels very empowering, you know. So I think your work and the comic book work especially, I think that's what makes it, all the things you've said and other people have said, you know, I think in a moment when we're so embattled and feel, you know, are being actively made to feel not belonging or less than, it's so empowering.
It is absolutely. And so many of the people who identify this as their culture, I try to remind them, because many of them are my students as well, that the way people look at you and they say that you don't belong here, they see something. What they're seeing is your indigenous heritage. If you looked like you had entirely Spanish heritage, they would assume that you belong here.
Irony,
right?
isn't it?
And so, you know, there's some, I think embracing that indigenous heritage and holding on to it, I think can be very healing in these very difficult political times. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I think, Annette,
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you so much. I've learned so much from your work. I'm so glad you're here with us. So I had two quick things. One is to think about, I mean, you're sort of recovering the women, but I also wonder if you're recovering kind of, or sort of like clearing these codices, right? When we think about, you know, this idea that the strict binary is artificially imposed, and then we have kind of these deities, for not for lack of a better word, who are represented, have, clothing that represents both. So that's my sort of first question. And then the second is, if you could talk us through the last page of the Aztec comic, because that's the one where it's like this pedagogical thing that I think is really interesting, where
This one?
yeah, that one, where you sort of like, you use that last page to, instead of describing how to read the comic, actually like show us, like the reader is actively learning how codices are read on that page. And I love that page so much. I think it does so much work pedagogically that, again, it's very accessible. So those are my two questions. Choose to.
Yeah, no, they're both wonderful. Absolutely. That's my attempt is, I'm glad you said it. Yeah, I'm definitely trying to queer the codices. It's certainly a goal of mine. Though I think it's pretty easy, and I don't think it requires, it doesn't necessarily require like the
Yeah.
imposition of queer theory,
Mhm.
because it's all there.
Mhm.
It's all there. I'm not having to really re-signify things in any sort of way. I'm just pointing out things that a lot of people have chosen to ignore. Right? And this is something that I've seen in a number of different contexts. There's a very famous mural at Gagaxtla where there's a battle scene, and then there's an individual who's wearing Xochiquetzal and a skirt. And a number of scholars have said it's a man dressed up as a woman to show that they're being humiliated in battle. And very few, I think the McCaffertys, if people are familiar with the McCaffertys, as far as I've seen, have been the only scholars who are saying, oh, that might just be you bringing your own ideology to the table here. And so this is, I think, a common issue. But absolutely, I think that these kinds of binaries, this kind of strict adherence to our ideas of gender norms does not exist in the codices. And so if people have an eye for that kind of thing, it's everywhere. So thank you for acknowledging that. In terms of the last page, there's a lot in this page. I don't know if I will walk through the whole thing. But I really give, again, a lot of credit to my artist for this, because I taught him how I was reading it. And then he said, we can do this. We can do this together. And he's like, we can make it like manga, which also reads backwards. And so as him having this comic book background really was exceptionally helpful. Also, I've never met such an apt student for iconographic decipherment, because he's so used to writing with image and expressing non-verbally through image. And so he was able to just incorporate all the detail, all the nuance, all the little things that it takes. You know how many words it takes to describe these things, and to describe just simple things like at the bottom we see a woman who I say is having a child, and then beside her is this gomik, this pot that the child is coming out of. And these two images, the pot and the woman's body, are the same shape, they're the same size, they're the same color, and so having to describe that rather than just showing it visually and having this swoop and pointing out with the swoop that they're the same, it just is a lot easier to read than having to go through all the text that I just tried to describe.
And also it's teaching Indigenous literacy, which is really kind of incredible. I mean, sorry to interject.
Yeah, and I think for this project, I think one of the really inspiring things for me was that, I'm really challenging imagery that says that again, I'm putting myself 500 years in the past, we're cannibals, right? It's painting us as cannibalistic. And I won't say that cannibalism didn't happen. What I am saying is that a lot of these images are not that, right? And so when people see it everywhere, that's because that's how they view Aztec people. And so I've seen far more images like this that are quite obvious to me representations of miscarriage or birth, and relatively fluent. In fact, I think I've only seen one that looks similar that I think is actually cannibalism, and that was a post-contact text. And so these things are, I mean, there's a lot that I have to challenge, and so I'm really glad when we have something like this that really gets into the hands of far more people than say an article or a book, where people can say, "Oh, you think that's cannibalism?" Well, I saw, I'm like, "Oh, I'm so well read. I read a comic book." And
There's one before Jorge, hold on. It just, sorry, comment rather than a question, but what you're saying, it reminds me so much of Roman Jakobson's observation that languages differ not in what they can say, but what they must say. And, the fact that we're dealing with multiple gendered languages requires us to gender queer. It's like, well, some languages have neuter, it's,
right.
and so in addition to like overt ideological preconceptions, we're just dealing with the challenges of language. Oh, this is longer than I wanted it to be. But what this does drive home is, at this moment where we don't need humanities or language instruction, the way in which learning another language, that cognitive broadening is so powerful. So you're really driving that home in this in a really wonderful way in a new idiom. So Jorge, that was it. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. So it's like my question is like I have two questions. One is kind of related with Dr. Ravina's question. I feel the comic books, the language, the narrative is so different because there are a lot of dialogues, and also I saw a lot of humor in it. So it's like for the narrative wise, is there any stories you want to share, and also is there any challenges? And of course we will. Is that for the challenge part? I'm really interested. Secondly, it's like I'm really interested in the clothing part, because the clothing not only has the function as different gender identities, also feels like clothing is closely related with the role of reproduction or production. So I can see that the skirts is not very easy to work in the field, but the poncho may be really good in the battlefield, or it's like working outside. So that from that perspective, do you have any ideas want to share?
Yeah, good questions. Okay, I'm gonna have to think on that last one for a little while. Now, with the humor, right? In talking about these narratives, and so my second one, which is about my OL, is a narrative, right? It is the retelling of a story that the original has been lost. So we don't have the original in Nahuatl. It's called I don't speak French. The Histoire du Mexique. Right?
Think about in French, it would be du Mexique, but it's older French.
Yeah. So I basically had to go back. I worked a little bit with someone who could help me with the French and used what I could in terms of my knowledge of Spanish. And I basically tried to reverse engineer, like, okay, if this was because what they say is that it started in Nahuatl and then it was translated to Spanish, and then it was translated to French, and those other two documents have been lost or destroyed. And so reverse engineer based on the Spanish equivalent. And then how I know the Spanish often is translated to Nahuatl. And so it's complicated, but I really struggled with how much humor to add. I think humor is important, but I didn't want to add too much humor because I didn't want people to feel like I was making a mockery of these kinds of origin stories. And so that's a kind of a really challenging line to walk. And hopefully I didn't offend anyone. But I think if we want people to read them, we have to make them interesting, humorous, or other ways engaging. I don't want to just put some comic book images on dry, boring text. And so, so thank you. I mean, there's plenty of stories that I would love to see put into comic book form. I'm working on it. I have to work on my more dry academic book first, finish that one out, and then return. So thank you for that question. The other one, so thinking about the functionality of clothing, I think is important. I mean, certainly, if you're out in the heat, you're out in the sun, you're moving around a lot, you probably want something small. So you have a loincloth that's way easier than a skirt, certainly. But I think that there are also other elements involved. So for example, in the Codex Mendoza, there are quite a few images, and Codex Mendoza is a post-contact text. It was commissioned, people wanted to see these kinds of elements included in a book, and so we have an entire section about the raising of children. And it's a really interesting piece to look at, especially with students, because it shows how children were punished, and it was just brutal. Like they used basically like pepper spray. They'd burn chilies and they hold their faces over the fire to punish them. Which if you grew up in a house where probably your mom roasted chilies, and then you know that it's excruciating even from a long distance. So being right there with your face in the fire is tough. But in looking at those texts, what I think is really interesting is that the little boys are often presented, they're often illustrated naked. Sometimes in a loincloth, but often naked. Whereas the little girls are never naked. They're always wearing clothes. Now, this changes from tribal group to tribal group, and so I'm really just talking about Central Mexico and what we consider the Aztecs. But there's something else going on here, especially when you see warriors like the Coyolxauhqui stone, where the defeated warriors are almost always portrayed completely naked. And I think that is I think in some ways shows their complete loss of power and identity, right? And so clothing has a lot of meaning, and not just informative meaning, but it actually can make an individual. I also think that if you have a higher value placed on little girls, which they did, I mean, if you look at those little kids in the images, the little boys were doing manual labor. They were hauling sticks, right? The little girls were learning to make textiles. And so you end up with a much more valuable little child. I know that sounds terrible, but I mean, in the Western world, historically, little boys have been, and the Eastern world, right? Little boys have been the valuable children. And we see in the Codex Mendoza that it's kind of the opposite. You see these little girls being much more valuable, and so we never see them without clothes on. They're always dressed. And the only time we see them naked is actually during childbirth, which is considered in the Nahuatl and Mesoamerican tradition a battle. And so oftentimes women who die in battle are presented as defeated warriors. So that element of clothing has a lot more significance that really needs to be further addressed. Hopefully I kind of scratched around at your question a little bit, but
I like all of them.
okay.
Jorge, thanks for your patience.
Is there time or?
We got 5 minutes. Yeah, we're perfect.
Well, thank you. I really enjoy all these clearing of the codices. My question has more to do with the choice of subject that the Chicano movement. There's a switch from LULAC to the Chicano movement in terms of transforming pre-Columbian history, particularly Aztecs, as a center of identity, whereas in the LULAC period with Carlos Castañeda here, Catholicism is central to Mexican American identity from the 20s, 50s. My question has more to do with why. I mean, preface this with a lecture I gave today with students on religious shrines in Mexico from 1580 to 1630 or 1650. You have a multiplication of 250 of them in Mexico alone. It's not only Our Lady of Guadalupe, but there are hundreds, literally, of shrines around Catholicism, Catholic images after Trent. and they are all indigenous. To attribute them to Spaniards, it's a serious misconception. And we know that the history of most of these stories and narratives of the commoners that have these visions and encounters different miraculous images and statues and so on and so forth. It's spread all over Mesoamerica. And it's a decision on the part of the elites and commoners in these pueblos, in these indigenous towns, to really embrace Christianity from the bottom up. And so I wonder whether, the Florentine Code is a good example of that. This is not just a Moon and Franciscans thing, we're gonna eliminate idolatry. There's a participation of dozens of scholars, Valeriano, Juan Bautista, etc., who are learned Nahuas, leaders of communities who are very engaged in this project, in this Christian project of conversion. So it's not just Spaniards who are doing this. It's part of indigenous politics. Communities that are split, communities that are fragmented and have different agendas, and so some go in this direction, some go fully Catholic. And so how, as I was looking at this, I was imagining there are hundreds of codices that are colonial. The Dosage one,
Yes.
but there are hundreds.
Yes.
And these codices that are fully legal in courts of law, they were not. They were really legal documents of using courts and acknowledging in petitions and trials and petitions of grace, petitions of governance, but also justice. In the imagery, for instance, we have Relaciones Geográficas here. All these images, indigenous maps created in the 1580s, in which none of this is no longer central to indigenous identities. You have other symbolisms and other iconographies, by and large Christian, crosses and etc. And that is the center of all these new codices, títulos primordiales, etc. I wonder whether we could make graphic novels about these indigenous Christianity, indigenous Catholicism, as also as part of these indigenous identities. There are identities of most people in the Central Valley of California, just as much as Aztec Codices.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna come back around to your question. But what I'll say first off is that it was never my real intention when I first went to graduate school, like I'm gonna study the Aztecs. I'm really interested in Aztecs. Really, it came down to I was interested in ancient Mesoamerica, and there was just a lot of material. Right, there's just a ton of material that you're talking about here, right? Tons of. There's many thousands of alphabetic documents all over Mexico, and even in areas where that's not the language they speak, because it's the second language of a lot of indigenous groups, or it was at the time of the Spanish arrival. And so it was really kind of a practical venture. I was interested in this, and there were so many texts, so many resources. It was relatively simple for me to learn the language, which I do want to point out that there is somewhat of a indigenous peoples renaissance going on right now, and so there are still quite a few Nahua people who still believe in Xochiquetzal, they still believe in their corn deity, and they believe in it right alongside Jesus, right? And so these things are still there, they're still being practiced. But you're absolutely right. Catholicism, especially, has been very prevalent in the history of religious change throughout Latin America. I would argue, and I think that there are plenty of others who would argue the same. I know Louise Burkhart wrote Slippery Earth. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Slippery Earth does a really wonderful job of talking about how the attempt to convert to Catholicism or various Christian sects was not successful, was never truly successful, because you can't remove the ideology from the language itself. And so as long as you still have people who are speaking their indigenous language, which we still have over 1.5 million Nahuatl speakers, you can't ever truly convert them 100%. And so I think that that is a valid argument. I will also say that the things that the Spaniards chose to instruct on in terms of Catholicism, the ones that stuck the best were the things where they already had traditions that were very similar, right? And so the baptismal, right? They really loved the La Virgen, right? Because they had a culture with a lot of these female mother deities, right? And so these are the things that really, that they clung on to. The love of the baby Jesus, which is not really a thing in other branches of Christianity and Catholicism, because that plays a key role in things like corn. I don't like the word worship, but corn veneration, right? That you need to care for it as a baby, and then it grows up and nurtures you. And so these kinds of things, I think, really play into it. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, Catholicism, syncretism, change absolutely does happen. I do think it's interesting to point out, though, that I know there was some research that came out of Pew Research Center. Well, that was probably like 10 years ago now, though, that said that Hispanic Catholics knew their own religion worse than any other group. Right? And I think that there's a reason for that, because Latino Catholicism does not look like the Catholicism we see in the Vatican. Right? It's been molded, it's been shifted, it's been changed, and it is an indigenous Catholicism. But yeah,
I would say that religion is not about theology, it's about embodied practices.
Right. Yeah.
So they are embodied differently in the Vatican than they are in I don't know, in Coyolxauhqui.
Very differently. Yeah.
So it's not really about theology. So yeah, I mean, I'm a historian of colonial discourses, instead of knowledge. And I actually, for the first time, came to read the Bible when I came to the United States. I was trained by Jesuits in Ecuador, and I never freaking read the Bible.
That's very Jesuit. I'm just I'm just from the outside. I will never.
Ever. So I came to discover here what's transubstantiation and yet I lead Catholicism every day in these schools. So I am very skeptical of religion as theology and beliefs. So you can have Catholicism without any theology whatsoever and still be part of that community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm recalling what you said, right? This idea that religion is really from the bottom up, right? This idea that the embracing of Catholicism was bottom up. And I think that there's some truth to that. And I'll say in the histories, as well as we can piece together, of skirmishes among Mesoamerican groups, when one group kind of overtook another. Oh, I don't like conquest, right? There's a lot of words in English I do not like, and I use square quotes a lot. But when two groups would battle and one triumphed over the other, oftentimes there would be an imposition of their patron, whatever deity, right? And so indigenous religion was always very additive. Like, oh, well, apparently your God's stronger than mine. We'll just add it to the mix. And so this was not something that they had to teach indigenous people how to do. I'm like, oh, okay, well, looks like we're adding this one right on top here. And so I think it was absolutely a bottom-up kind of thing. They did not have to convince them, like, you need to. And you're like, oh, yeah, I recognize it. I'll also say what I love about reading the Spanish, the journals and whatnot, is there absolutely seems to be a recognition of the indigenous deities. It's not so much that they say these are false. They say like, oh, they're the wrong ones and they're demons. And so I kind of love that. I'm like, see, they believed in them too, but they believed they were evil. And so I don't know. I guess I find some comfort in that. So I love that they didn't really extinguish a lot of those things. And plenty of people have talked about how a lot of this indigenous worship, this veneration, was actually just ancestor veneration. And it wasn't any, capital G, eye in the sky kind of God. And so a lot of those figures kind of became saints, kind of got mapped on over to saints. So they're still believing in them, just in different forms, in different ways. And I will say that Hispanic Catholics love their saints. Love their saints. Yeah.
Running over late in this semester, what a great sign. Thank you. Fantastic questions and fantastic answers. Thank you. Dr. Lopez, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone online.
Please.
Yes, absolutely.